It was a quiet morning when the trouble began. The sun had just risen, casting its golden light over the small house near the forest. Birds were chirping, and the leaves rustled gently in the wind. The world felt peaceful just the way Thomas liked it. He lived alone in a modest home surrounded by nature, a place that had been in his family for generations. It wasn't much, but it was his, and that was enough. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee. He enjoyed the mornings most, when the world was still and the only sound was the soft hum of life around him. But that morning, something felt off. A low, distant hum reached his ears, growing louder with each passing second. He looked out the window, frowning as a car slowly rolled up the gravel path leading to his front door. It wasn't just any car. It was a sleek, black vehicle with tinted windows, the kind that looked out of place in his small, quiet neighborhood. Thomas felt a twinge of unease. As the car stopped and the door opened, a woman stepped out. She was tall, wearing a formal suit that looked far too fancy for the rural surroundings. Her heels clicked on the gravel as she walked toward the house, carrying a clipboard in one hand and a stern expression on her face. Thomas stood up and walked to the door, pulling it open just as the woman reached the steps. She smiled, but it was a cold smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said in a voice that was too businesslike to be friendly. "I'm Karen Williams, from the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "I'm not a part of any HOA," he replied. "I don't even know what that is." Karen's smile didn't falter, though a flicker of impatience crossed her face. "Well, that's the problem, Mr. Thomas. You see, the Homeowners Association has certain rules and regulations, and we've noticed that your property is outside of our jurisdiction." She glanced down at the clipboard, then back up at him, her gaze more focused now. "We're here to discuss the possibility of bringing your land into our association." Thomas blinked, surprised. "What do you mean, bringing my land into your association? I've been living here for years, and I've never had any issues." Karen straightened up, her voice becoming more insistent. "The HOA's goal is to make sure all properties are maintained to a certain standard. It's about community, Mr. Thomas. The residents who are part of the HOA enjoy better services, better security, and better protection from outside interference. By joining, you'll ensure your property is up to the HOA standards." Thomas crossed his arms. "I don't need your services. I'm perfectly fine as I am." Karen ignored his comment, her eyes scanning the area around the house as if making a judgment. "You may not think you need the HOA, but believe me, it's for the best. We've noticed that your land, well, it doesn't quite fit with the rest of the neighborhood. The trees around here are a bit overgrown, and the property could benefit from some landscaping." Thomas followed her gaze toward the forest behind his house, the place he loved most. The trees had been there for decades, their roots deep in the soil. He had never felt the need to trim them or alter anything about them. The land had always been a part of him, and he wasn't about to let anyone tell him what to do with it. "I'm not interested in landscaping," he said firmly. "And I don't need anyone telling me how to take care of my property." Karen's smile slipped for just a moment, and her tone grew sharper. "Mr. Thomas, I don't think you understand. The HOA has power here. We manage the neighborhood, and if you don't join, there could be consequences. The rules are in place to protect everyone." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. He didn't like the way she was speaking, as though he had no choice in the matter. His gaze shifted toward the forest, and an idea formed in his mind. This wasn't just about a neighborhood rule. It was about control. "Karen," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm, "I don't want to be part of your HOA, and I don't want anyone telling me what to do with my land." He stepped back from the door, standing taller now, his confidence growing. "This forest is mine, and I'll keep it the way I see fit." For a moment, Karen didn't respond. She simply stood there, her eyes narrowing as if she was processing what he had just said. Then, she smiled again, but this time it was not a polite smile. It was a smile that seemed to carry a warning, a subtle threat. "Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice cold, "I suggest you reconsider. You don't want to make an enemy of the HOA." Thomas met her gaze without hesitation. "I'm not afraid of your HOA." With that, Karen turned and walked back toward her car, her heels clicking on the gravel with each step. Thomas watched her leave, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't the end of the matter. He had just begun to make a stand, and he wouldn't let anyone take what was his, especially not someone like her. As the car disappeared down the road, Thomas turned back to look at the forest behind his house. He felt a deep sense of pride in the land he had inherited. It was more than just property, it was his heritage, his legacy. No one would take it from him. But little did Thomas know, this was just the beginning. The HOA would not let go so easily. The next few days were quiet, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's visit was just the beginning of something much bigger. He tried to return to his normal routine, spending his mornings tending to his small garden and afternoons walking through the forest behind his house. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the smell of fresh earth helped calm his mind. Yet, every time he stepped outside, he couldn't help but think of Karen's words, "You don't want to make an enemy of the HOA." Thomas had lived in the house for over a decade, and his family had owned the land for generations. He had always taken pride in maintaining his small corner of the world. The forest was a place of peace for him, not something to be controlled by a group of strangers who didn't understand its value. Karen's words echoed in his mind, and he knew that something had to be done. He couldn't let her or the HOA have any power over his land. 2 days after Karen's visit, there was another knock on his door. This time, Thomas didn't hesitate. He walked to the door, opened it, and found Karen standing on his porch again, holding a thick folder. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thomas," she greeted him in her usual formal tone, not at all surprised to see him standing there. "I hope you've had time to think about our conversation." Thomas crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe. "I've thought about it, Karen. And my answer is still no. I don't want to be part of your HOA." Karen's smile wavered, but only for a second. She didn't seem angry, she seemed more determined. "Mr. Thomas, I'm afraid you don't fully understand the situation. The HOA has certain standards, and your land doesn't meet them. If you refuse to join, we might have to take further steps." Thomas felt a tightening in his chest. "What do you mean by further steps?" Karen's expression didn't change, but there was a coldness in her eyes. "If you remain outside the HOA, you might find your property facing certain restrictions. We can't allow someone to keep land that doesn't adhere to the neighborhood guidelines." Thomas felt his anger rising. "I've been maintaining my property for years without any trouble. I don't need you telling me how to live." Karen didn't back down. "It's not just about how you live, Mr. Thomas. It's about the community. You're holding us back. If you don't join the HOA, we'll have no choice but to enforce the rules." She paused, then added, "And we can't have one property holding back the entire neighborhood's progress." Thomas stared at her, disbelief growing in his chest. He had never imagined that something as simple as his decision to stay out of an HOA could cause so much trouble. He had never asked anyone for permission to live the way he wanted. Now, it seemed like his peaceful life was being threatened by someone who didn't even understand the land he loved. "I won't be forced into something I don't want," Thomas replied firmly. "I've lived here long before the HOA came around. And I'll keep living here just the way I always have." Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his resolve. "I was hoping you'd see reason, but if you're determined to be difficult, we'll have no choice but to escalate things. The HOA has resources, Mr. Thomas. Legal resources. We can make this very difficult for you." Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. He had heard rumors of how the HOA had used their power to intimidate other residents, forcing them to comply or face fines, lawsuits, and even losing their homes. The thought of it made his blood boil. But he wasn't going to let Karen have that kind of control over him. This was his land, and he wouldn't let anyone take it from him. "I'm not afraid of your resources," Thomas said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "You may think you can bully me, but I'm not backing down." Karen seemed to study him for a moment, her cold smile reappearing. "We'll see about that, Mr. Thomas. But don't say I didn't warn you." With those words, she turned and walked back to her car, leaving Thomas standing in the doorway, his mind racing. As the days passed, Thomas noticed that Karen's threats weren't empty. He began receiving letters in the mail from the HOA, each one more aggressive than the last. The first letter was a polite reminder to join the association. The second one was a warning, threatening legal action if he didn't comply. The third letter demanded he pay a fine for not following the HOA's community standards. The letters were always addressed to the property owner, never by his name. It felt impersonal and cold, like the HOA was trying to erase his connection to the land. Thomas wasn't the only one receiving these letters. Several of his neighbors had also been contacted, though they all seemed hesitant to take a stand. They were afraid of the HOA's power and didn't want to rock the boat. But Thomas wasn't afraid. He knew what was at stake. He couldn't allow Karen and her HOA to push him around, especially not when it came to something as important as his home. He spent the next few days going over old property records, looking for anything that could help him fight back. He discovered that his family's land had been part of the original settlement in the area, long before any HOA had even existed. He knew that the HOA had no legal claim over his property, and he was ready to make that clear. But as Thomas prepared for a fight, he knew this wouldn't be easy. Karen wasn't going to give up without a struggle, and she wasn't the type to back down. The battle for his land had just begun, and Thomas was determined to win, no matter what it took. The days following Karen's visit were filled with tension. Thomas had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this was something new. The HOA had its sights set on him, and he had a feeling that they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. He spent his mornings at the local library, combing through old property records and legal documents. He needed to find something that would prove he had every right to keep his land, free from the HOA's control. The library was quiet, and the smell of old books filled the air as Thomas sat at a table, carefully flipping through the worn pages of a ledger. He found references to the original landowners, records dating back over a century. His family's name appeared multiple times, marking the land as their property long before anyone had ever heard of an HOA. As he dug deeper, Thomas started to notice something strange. The HOA, which had seemed so powerful and unyielding just a few weeks ago, was connected to more than just neighborhood rules. The more he read, the clearer it became: the HOA had a history of seizing land. The documents mentioned properties that had been acquired from homeowners under questionable circumstances, often with the owners feeling pressured or coerced into selling. Thomas frowned as he skimmed through another document. The HOA wasn't just a group that managed neighborhood rules, it was a powerful organization with its own agenda. He had suspected that Karen was more than just a strict enforcer of rules, but this confirmed it. She was part of a larger operation, one that sought to control not just the neighborhood but the land itself. The more he read, the more disturbed he became. There were references to people who had been pushed out of their homes, some of whom had even lost their properties in court battles they could never have won. The HOA had used its influence to push people out, and now it was doing the same to him. Thomas sat back in his chair, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He had always known that land could be a powerful thing, but he hadn't realized how much power the HOA had. He thought about his family, about how they had worked so hard to keep this place alive. This wasn't just about a house or a plot of land, it was about something much deeper. It was about his heritage, his connection to the earth beneath his feet. With the evidence he had gathered, Thomas knew he had a choice to make. He could let the HOA push him around, give in to their threats, or he could fight back. He wasn't going to let Karen and her group take what wasn't theirs. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that he had to stand up to them. But he needed to be careful. He knew the HOA wouldn't back down easily. That afternoon, Thomas took the documents he had found to a lawyer in town. The lawyer, a calm man named Mr. Green, listened quietly as Thomas explained everything. Mr. Green looked over the papers and then set them down on his desk. "This is more serious than I thought," Mr. Green said, his voice thoughtful. "The HOA has a long history of pushing people out of their homes, and it's clear they've been using their power to take control of land in this area. But this evidence is strong. Your family's land has been theirs for generations, and it doesn't seem like the HOA has any legal right to it." Thomas nodded, feeling a small spark of hope. "So you think we can win?" Mr. Green leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping gently on the desk. "It's not going to be easy. The HOA has resources, and they'll fight hard to keep their control. But with these documents, we have a strong case. If we can prove they've been using unfair tactics to take land, we might just have a chance." Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time in days, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. Mr. Green was a professional, and he knew how to navigate the legal maze that lay ahead. But Thomas also knew that the real battle was just beginning. The HOA had made it clear they weren't going to give up without a fight. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the history of the land and what it meant to him. He could hear the rustling of the trees outside, a sound that had always brought him peace. But now, that same forest felt like a battleground. The next day, Thomas returned home from the lawyer's office to find another letter waiting for him. He already knew what it would say. It was the same as the others, a demand to join the HOA or face legal consequences. But this one was different. At the bottom of the letter was a small note, written in Karen's familiar handwriting: "You have one last chance, Mr. Thomas. Join the HOA, or we'll make you regret it." Thomas crumpled the letter in his hand and threw it into the trash. He wasn't going to back down. He had proof now, and he was ready to take the next step. He had to make sure the HOA understood that they couldn't control him or his land. As he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the forest, Thomas knew that the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. But he was determined. His family's land was his, and no one, especially not someone like Karen, was going to take it from him. The tension had been building for weeks, and Thomas knew the time had come to confront Karen and the HOA. The letters had become more frequent, each one more demanding than the last. He had already made his decision, and there was no turning back. He couldn't let them push him around any longer. The meeting was set for Friday afternoon at the local community hall. Karen had sent an official invitation, saying it was a mandatory HOA meeting, and Thomas had no intention of missing it. He had gathered all the evidence he needed to show that the HOA's claims to his land were false, and he wasn't going to let Karen intimidate him any longer. On the day of the meeting, Thomas arrived early, walking into the community hall with a feeling of quiet determination. The room was filled with neatly dressed people who didn't seem too concerned with the upcoming discussion. Most of them were members of the HOA, people who had long since given up any resistance. They were used to Karen's control. But not Thomas. He was there to make a stand. Karen stood at the front of the room, her cold smile in place as she greeted the attendees. She was speaking with a few of the other HOA members, but as soon as she saw Thomas, her smile faltered for just a moment. Her eyes narrowed, and Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders. She didn't expect him to show up, and certainly didn't expect him to come prepared. "Ah, Mr. Thomas," Karen said, her voice still smooth but tinged with annoyance. "I'm glad you could join us. We were just about to start." Thomas walked up to the front of the room, calmly setting a stack of papers on the table. I don't need to be a part of your HOA, Karen. I've already told you that. But I'm here to make sure you understand something. The room grew quiet as everyone turned their attention to him. Karen's face tightened, and she crossed her arms in front of her chest. What exactly is it that you think you're going to accomplish here? She asked, her voice steady but with a hint of frustration. I'm here to show you that I'm not backing down, Thomas replied, his voice firm. And to show everyone in this room that you have no right to control my land. My family has owned this property for generations, and the HOA has no claim to it. Karen let out a sharp laugh, but it was clear it was forced. Mr. Thomas, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. You've had plenty of time to think this over. It's not about control. It's about keeping the neighborhood safe and looking out for everyone's best interests. Thomas took a deep breath, then continued, I don't need you to keep my neighborhood safe. I'm not a part of your HOA, and I never will be. But I'm not here just to tell you no. I'm here to show you that you've been lying to everyone. He pulled a few of the documents from the stack and laid them out on the table. These are property records, court cases, and legal documents that show the HOA has been using deceptive tactics to force people out of their homes, just like you're trying to do to me. Karen's face turned pale as she looked at the papers. For a moment, there was a crack in her confident demeanor. She glanced around the room, and Thomas could see that the other members were beginning to pay attention. The facade of her power was starting to crumble. Mr. Thomas, she said, her voice shaky for the first time, I don't know where you're getting these documents, but this isn't the place to air your grievances. I'm airing the truth, Karen, Thomas replied, not backing down. And if anyone here thinks that the HOA has their best interests in mind, they're wrong. This isn't about community, this is about control. You've been using your power to intimidate people, forcing them into your HOA, making them pay for services they don't need. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The other members of the HOA were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and Thomas could see that the tide was turning. He wasn't just fighting Karen anymore, he was fighting the system she had built, and the room could feel the weight of his words. One of the older members of the HOA, a man named Mr. Davis, stood up. He had always been a quiet figure in the meetings, someone who rarely spoke out. But now, his voice was strong and clear. I've been with the HOA for years, Mr. Davis said, his gaze moving from Karen to Thomas. And I've seen a lot of things I don't agree with. If what Mr. Thomas is saying is true, then we've all been misled. The room was silent for a moment. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone else to speak, to break the tension. Finally, another member, a woman named Mrs. Allen, spoke up. I've heard rumors about the HOA using pressure tactics to force people into joining, she said, her voice hesitant but growing stronger with each word. And I've seen the fines. I don't like it, but I didn't know what to do. Thomas turned to face them, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his chance. You don't have to let Karen control you. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. The HOA can't keep using fear to manipulate people. We deserve better. Karen's face turned bright red as she tried to regain control of the room. This is enough. I will not stand for this disruption. But it was clear that her words no longer carried the same weight. The room had shifted, and Karen's grip on the HOA was loosening. Thomas had done it, he had exposed her, and the rest of the community was beginning to see the truth. As the meeting continued, it was no longer about following Karen's rules. The conversation had changed, and the power dynamics had shifted. Karen could feel it too. She had lost the room, and she knew it. Thomas stood tall, knowing that this was only the beginning of the battle. But today, he had won the first round. The confrontation at the community meeting had changed everything. After Thomas had presented the evidence, the other members of the HOA seemed to waver in their support of Karen. People who had once silently followed her now found themselves questioning everything she had said. The truth about the HOA's shady tactics was out in the open, and the once unquestioned leader was beginning to lose her grip. But Karen wasn't going to give up easily. The next day, Thomas received a letter from her, a legal document this time, not a simple reminder. The HOA was taking him to court. He read the letter carefully, his eyes scanning the words that promised a drawn-out legal battle. The HOA was seeking an injunction to force him to join the association and pay the fees for services he had never asked for. It was clear that Karen and her team were not about to let him win without a fight. They were using every tool at their disposal, including the law. Thomas wasn't surprised. He had known from the beginning that Karen wouldn't give up just because a few people had started to question her authority. But now it was serious. The HOA wasn't just a group of people trying to control his land, they were trying to strip him of his rights through legal action. That evening, Thomas sat down with his lawyer, Mr. Green, to discuss the next steps. Mr. Green had been helping him since the first meeting, and he had proven to be a reliable ally. He sat across from Thomas in his small office, the walls lined with legal books and case files. "So, what's our next move?" Thomas asked, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. The thought of a courtroom battle was overwhelming, but he knew he couldn't back down now. Mr. Green glanced at the papers in front of him before looking back at Thomas. "We have a solid case. We've got proof that the HOA has used deceptive tactics to force people into joining. Your family's land has been in your possession for generations, and the HOA can't just claim it. But we'll need to prepare for a long fight." Thomas nodded. He had expected as much. He had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this felt different. The HOA had resources, and they were willing to use them. But Thomas wasn't about to let them take what was rightfully his. "You said we have a solid case," Thomas said. "What do we need to do to make sure we win?" Mr. Green leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen thoughtfully. "First, we need to show that the HOA's actions are not just unfair, they're illegal. We'll need to gather more evidence of their past behavior and show how they bullied other residents into compliance. The more proof we have, the stronger our case will be." Thomas spent the next few days gathering everything he could find, more documents, old records, anything that could help him prove that the HOA's practices were wrong. It was exhausting, but it gave him a sense of purpose. He was fighting for something much bigger than just his own land, he was fighting for everyone who had been pushed around by the HOA's power. As the court date approached, Thomas felt a mixture of nerves and determination. He spent hours preparing with Mr. Green, going over every detail of the case. They went over the evidence again and again, making sure that every argument was solid and every fact was backed up by documentation. Thomas knew that the HOA would do everything they could to twist the truth and make him seem like the problem. He had to be ready for that. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. Thomas walked into the courthouse with Mr. Green by his side. The building was tall and imposing, a reminder of the power that institutions like the HOA held. But Thomas wasn't afraid. He had the truth on his side, and that was all he needed. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Karen sat at the opposing table, flanked by her lawyers. She shot Thomas a cold, calculating glance as he walked in, but he didn't let it faze him. This was his moment to stand up for himself, and he wasn't going to back down. The judge called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Karen's lawyer spoke first, making the case that Thomas was in violation of the HOA's rules and that his property was part of their jurisdiction. They argued that the HOA had every right to require membership and fees from Thomas, even if he had lived on the land for years without ever joining. Mr. Green stood up to present their case. He calmly and confidently laid out the evidence that showed how the HOA had used underhanded tactics to force people into joining. He pointed to the documents Thomas had gathered, detailing how the HOA had manipulated the legal system to seize land and intimidate residents. As Mr. Green spoke, Thomas could feel the tide turning in their favor. The judge seemed to listen carefully, weighing the evidence before her. Karen's lawyer tried to counter every point, but it was clear that their arguments were falling short. They didn't have the proof that Mr. Green and Thomas had. By the time it was Thomas's turn to speak, he was ready. He stood before the judge, his heart beating steadily in his chest, and explained why this fight was so important. This isn't just about land. It's about my family's history. We've owned this property for generations, and the HOA has no right to tell me what to do with it. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the right to live my life on my terms. The courtroom was silent as the judge took in Thomas's words. It felt like an eternity before she finally spoke. I will review the evidence and make my decision, she said. This case is about more than just a neighborhood dispute. It's about property rights and the power of an organization to impose its will on others. I will take everything into consideration before making a ruling. As Thomas sat back down, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like he had a real chance of winning. The days leading up to the judge's ruling were filled with uncertainty. Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the courtroom, replaying every moment of the trial in his mind. He knew they had presented a strong case, but Karen's determination to win was not something he could ignore. The HOA had deep pockets, and their lawyers were experienced. He had never imagined that he would be up against something so powerful. As he sat in his small living room, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision that lay ahead. The forest outside his window seemed peaceful, but Thomas knew that a storm was brewing. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the future of the neighborhood and whether the HOA would be allowed to control every inch of land. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, just as Thomas was finishing his breakfast. He picked up the receiver, his heart pounding in his chest. Mr. Thomas, the voice on the other end was calm, but it was the voice of the court clerk. The judge has reached a decision. The hearing is scheduled for this afternoon. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The decision had come sooner than expected. He quickly agreed to the time and made his way to the courthouse, his nerves building with every step he took. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to be ready for whatever came next. When Thomas arrived at the courthouse, the usual sense of authority and order filled the air. The building felt imposing, its cold walls and high ceilings reminding him of how much was on the line. As he entered the courtroom, his eyes immediately found Karen, who was sitting at the front, her back straight and her expression unreadable. She didn't look worried, but Thomas could see the tension in her posture. She knew that the decision was about to change everything. The judge took her seat, and the room fell silent. She was a woman in her 50s, with sharp features and a calm demeanor. She glanced at both sides of the courtroom before speaking. After reviewing the evidence presented during this case, I have reached a decision. This case is not just about property rights or HOA regulations. It is about the balance of power and the need for fairness in how communities are managed. Thomas sat up straighter, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. The judge's words gave him hope, but he knew it wasn't over yet. The judge continued. I find that the HOA has acted beyond its scope in this case. The evidence provided by Mr. Thomas and his lawyer demonstrates that the HOA has used unfair tactics to manipulate property owners into joining. The documents presented also show that the HOA has been involved in questionable actions regarding land acquisitions. Karen shifted in her seat, her expression darkening. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced at Thomas, but he didn't back down. He kept his eyes forward, determined to see this through to the end. The court finds in favor of Mr. Thomas, the judge declared, her voice steady. The HOA has no legal claim to his property. The injunction against him is dismissed, and he is not required to join the HOA. Additionally, the HOA will be required to pay a fine for its actions in this case. A wave of relief washed over Thomas. He could hardly believe it. He had won. After all the uncertainty, all the threats, he had finally prevailed. The judge looked down at Karen and her legal team, who were visibly stunned. Karen's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. The other members of the HOA were sitting in silence, not knowing how to respond. The HOA is prohibited from using any more coercive tactics to force residents into joining, the judge added. And I will be overseeing the implementation of a new set of guidelines to ensure that homeowners are treated fairly and without intimidation. Thomas felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth, but he didn't let himself relax just yet. He had won this battle, but there were still consequences to deal with. Karen might be defeated, but he knew that the HOA's influence wouldn't disappear overnight. As the judge banged the gavel, signaling the end of the hearing, Thomas stood up and shook Mr. Green's hand. He couldn't help but feel grateful for the lawyer's support and expertise throughout the entire process. He had never been one to ask for help, but he was glad he had trusted Mr. Green. Karen and her lawyers stood up too, but they didn't say anything. Karen's face was a picture of fury, but there was nothing she could do now. The court had spoken, and the power had shifted away from her. As Thomas walked out of the courthouse, he felt a mix of emotions: relief, triumph, and even a bit of disbelief. It had been a long, hard fight, but he had stood his ground. He had protected his family's land, and he had shown the HOA that they couldn't push people around forever. But more than that, Thomas realized something even more important. He had won not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood. His victory sent a message to everyone who had been afraid to stand up against the HOA. It wasn't just about property, it was about standing up for what was right. As he walked toward his car, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The forest behind his house seemed even more beautiful now. It wasn't just a place he lived, it was a symbol of his fight, his victory, and the freedom he had worked so hard to protect. The days after the court ruling were filled with a mix of quiet reflection and cautious optimism. The battle had been long, but the victory was sweet. Thomas had won, and the HOA's hold on the neighborhood had finally been broken. Yet, even in the midst of his success, he knew that the fight wasn't truly over. The HOA may have lost in court, but they weren't the type to let go of their control so easily. Karen and her supporters would be back, and they would likely try something else. But Thomas was no longer worried. The court had spoken, and the HOA had been exposed for what they were: a group more interested in power than community. The rest of the neighborhood, many of whom had been quietly following Karen's leadership, were now seeing things differently. The moment of truth had arrived, and Thomas had shown them the strength of standing up for what was right. Over the next few weeks, the community slowly began to change. People who had been too afraid to speak out now found their voices. Neighbors who had once feared Karen's influence started coming together, offering their support to Thomas and one another. They shared stories of how they had felt pressured by the HOA, how they had been afraid to stand up, even though they knew something wasn't right. It was a quiet revolution, but it was happening. And it started with Thomas's decision to fight back. One afternoon, as Thomas was walking through his property, he saw a few of his neighbors standing near the edge of the forest. They waved at him, and he walked over, curious. "Hey, Thomas," one of the neighbors, a man named George, said with a smile. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you did. You really opened my eyes to what's been going on. I didn't realize how much power the HOA had until you stood up to them." Thomas nodded, grateful for the kind words. "I wasn't the only one fighting," he said. "It's all of us. We just needed someone to show us that it was possible to stand up." Another neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, added, "You've given us all courage. My family was scared to join the HOA. We didn't want to pay the fees, but we didn't know what would happen if we said no. I didn't want to lose our home." Thomas listened carefully to each story. he realized that his victory was not just his own, it was for everyone who had been too afraid to challenge the system. In many ways, the real win had been showing people that they had the power to take back control of their own lives. As the community began to rebuild itself, it became clear that things were changing. The HOA, once a tight-knit and controlling organization, was slowly losing its grip. Neighbors were beginning to work together in a way they hadn't before. They started to help one another with yard work, shared resources, and even held small community events where they could meet and get to know each other better. Karen, on the other hand, had become a shadow of her former self. After the court ruling, she had been forced to step down as the HOA president. Her reputation had been tarnished, and the support she once had began to fade. It didn't take long for her to quietly fade from the spotlight. The influence she had once wielded seemed to disappear overnight. But for Thomas, it wasn't about her defeat, it was about what had been gained. The community was no longer under the thumb of a single individual. It was becoming a place where people could live without fear of being controlled. It was a place where people could make their own decisions, without someone else telling them what to do. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a soft orange, Thomas stood on his porch and looked out at the forest. The trees were taller than ever, their branches reaching up toward the sky as if they were standing strong, just like him. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that things could change, and that standing up for what was right could make a difference. As the wind whispered through the leaves, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace. He had protected what mattered most: his land, his home, and his community. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe freely. The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up, and a familiar voice greeted him on the other end. "Thomas, it's George. We were talking, and we think it's time for a community meeting. A real one. Without the HOA. What do you think?" Thomas smiled, the weight of the past few weeks lifting from his shoulders. "I think it's time," he said, his voice full of conviction. "Let's do it." As the conversation ended, Thomas looked out at the forest one last time. He knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a community coming together, standing strong against the forces that tried to control them. And as the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle had been won, but this was only the beginning. Together, they would build something better, something that couldn't be taken away.